Today's lecture is going to be covering the Baroque. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the countries of Italy and Spain. Now, the Baroque is sometimes referred to as the art of ecstasy. It's really art that has gone over the top. The word Baroque itself is derived from a jeweler's term, which describes an irregularly shaped pearl, something that is beautiful, fascinating, and strange. The time period we're looking at is from the year 1600 to 1700. This is also the time period where the Renaissance has just ended, and now is considered the Baroque. We have the same patrons, though, as the Renaissance did. We look to the church, guilds, wealthy families, and civic bodies to purchase art. But of course, we have a new batch of artists. Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who perhaps is among the best sculptors of the day, as well as a great architect. One of the most amazing painters is Caravaggio. We're going to be jumping to Spain and looking at the works of Diego Velázquez. Rembrandt, up in Northern Europe. Lavinia Fontana. Some of our first female artists emerged from this time period, as well as Sofonisba, and probably the most famous, Artemisia Gentileschi. The first thing we need to do is really take a look at how different the Baroque is from the Renaissance. We have Titian's altarpiece at the left, Rubens' altarpiece at the right, both of which are the same subject matter, the Assumption of the Virgin. It was Wolf Lehn, the art historian, that was able to separate out the Baroque from the Renaissance. He considered the Renaissance to be linear, the idea that forms are solid and three-dimensional, mainly because we have the technique of chiaroscuro. The composition is closed, meaning everything happens within the frame. Also, light falls evenly upon the subjects. There's no real intense highlighting. The Baroque becomes more painterly. Forms and outlines merge, and you can't tell where one ends and one begins. We also have a tremendous amount of diagonals that are present, a seemingly greater amount of depth. And the emphasis here is on light, color, and shadow. Instead of chiaroscuro, we have a different term called tenebrism. Think about it this way. Artists care about how something is made, not what is made during the Baroque. We're also going to be focusing on the city of Rome, and at its center is St. Peter's Cathedral. St. Peter is arrested and eventually martyred on an inverted cross in 64 AD. It was Emperor Constantine who constructed a church on the site of Peter's grave. We had already discussed that during the Renaissance, it was Pope Julius II who rebuilt St. Peter's and had plans for an elaborate tomb for himself to be placed alongside St. Peter's. This never occurred. Now, during the Baroque, we have Pope Paul V beginning another rebuilding project at the cathedral. Keep in mind that St. Peter's Cathedral is made up by a variety of architects over a long period of time. We look at the facade being designed by Carlo Maderno, and this is actually based on the Church of Santa Susanna. The dome was designed by Michelangelo. The central plan by Bramante. And then the arms of the church are by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. If you had already taken an early civilizations class, you'll see that the arms, the double arcade that outstretches from the church, is made with the Doric order of Greek architecture. They're very plain columns, they're unadorned. It's exciting to see on top, though, the sculptures, 140 of them, created by different artists over a fairly long period of time. Bernini created the arms of the church, but he also created one of the most important areas within the church, the baldacchino. The baldacchino itself marks the building's most sacred spot. It is 100 feet in height. In fact, the area or space beneath the dome is so large that you could fit a football field inside on end. It would not even touch the top of the dome. But the baldacchino really fits this space very effectively. And this is at the point where we have the crossing of the church. This marks the grave of St. Peter's. And you can see with the light coming in from the dome above that light itself really plays a part in this artwork. It's made from gilt bronze, and you can see, especially in the image at the right, that the columns rest on a marble base. There is the papal insignia as well that is on the marble base, and those are about 6 foot tall. So it's really part propaganda because it's letting you know that the Pope brought this to you. It is his insignia. The spiral columns were inspired by those used in the Temple of Solomon, and the columns symbolize the union of the Old and New Testaments. There's a vine growing on the column, which is a grapevine, and it is part of the Eucharist. The vine contains laurel leaves, which is a symbol of the Barberini family, and that is who is the Pope. There are angels at the very top of the canopy, perhaps giving us a glimpse of what heaven is like, and they're linked together with the small cherub figures by strands of garland. Hanging over the edge, which you can see in the image at the left, are these little areas of cloth and bees. And again, bees symbolize the Barberini family, who is the sitting Pope. There's also an orb at the very top, which is not shown, and that symbolizes the universe. And the cross above that represents the reign of Christ. And here's a close-up of the base. And again, these are 6 foot marble bases. Surrounding the baldacchino at the crossing are 4 sculptures. Longinus was the Roman soldier who pierced the side of Christ with a spear, and he ends up converting to Christianity. Saint Helen holds the true cross. Saint Veronica wipes Christ's face with a veil, and his imprint stays on the veil. And finally, St. Andrew, holding St. Andrew's cross. Now, relics of each saint are contained in St. Peter's and brought out on special days, put above these sculptures on the balconies. And relics are basically remains of saints. They can be, for instance, hairs of the Virgin Mary or a bone from St. Thomas. However, they can also be like relics of the true cross, splinters of wood, for instance. These are highly prized and thought to have special powers. They could heal the sick, but they could also reduce your time in purgatory. We're going to look at some sculptures by Bernini, and he really is, he's probably my favorite sculptor. There is a certain motion, a certain dynamism that is contained within his works. And I always argue that if not, he's at least as good as Michelangelo, he's probably a bit better. And I know that's probably blasphemy to say, but when you look at the dynamic pose, for instance, of this statue of David, how different it is from Michelangelo's version. And of course, much different than Donatello's as well. Here you have a life-sized figure, about 6 foot tall, who's fully wound up to release the rock that is going to knock out Goliath. And you can see the figure has discarded all of his armor, and he is again on a diagonal, which really lets us know that this is an unstable body position. Our brain picks up on this, and we know that change is imminent. And here we are looking at the difference between Bernini versus Michelangelo's sculpture of David. Now, in the very next room from the statue of David, which was really even though it was a commission by the Pope, it was for his nephew as a gift. The Apollo and Daphne sculpture in the next room from the David is one of my favorites. Daphne is a wood nymph that is being pursued by Apollo, and she is asking the gods to help facilitate her escape. However, the gods do so by turning her into a tree. So we have, again, a very fluid sculpture. You can see some textile or robe or cloth around this figure of Apollo. Daphne herself slowly metamorphosizing into a tree. At the right-hand side, everyone looks very human. On the left-hand side, you can see that bark has enveloped her body and her arms are turning into branches, her fingers turning into leaves. And it's really quite impressive, again, to think that this is stone. This is not a pliable or malleable material. When Bernini completes Pluto and Persephone, he is only 23 years old. This is literally, 2 years younger than when Michelangelo completed his first major sculptural project, the Pietà. The flesh, though, is very similar. It's very lifelike. And we see the struggling Persephone trying to facilitate her escape. But the fingers of Pluto are firmly entrenched into her body, just as Mary's fingers tenderly absorb the body of Christ here. One final sculpture we'll look at by Bernini is Saint Teresa in Ecstasy. And this is somewhat sculpture, somewhat architecture. It's just an incredibly large artwork. It's in the Coronaro Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. And it took Bernini 10 years to complete this. The total height of the group is 11 feet 6 inches. And again, color plays a major part. You can see the golden rods of the sunbeams coming down at the back of this sculpture. They're illuminated by this window at the very top that is hidden from the viewers. So it looks very much like heavenly light shining down on this figure. The marble columns on either side are multicolored, and it really is amazing when we look at a close-up of the forms themselves. The scene itself is St. Teresa's account of a vision she had of an angel piercing her body with an arrow. Indescribable pain, religious ecstasy, and a sense of oneness with God. We have witnesses on either side of the event, and I'll bring up that image again, and you can see that there's figures in the balcony of the left and right, and those are members of the Coronaro family, 7 of them in all, and exclaiming to each other about the miracle that they are seeing. And there's a couple reading from prayer books. Now we're going to move on to a different artist, Caravaggio. The most famous painter of the Baroque time period. His paintings contain a heightened sense of realism and dramatic lighting. They had a theatrical element about them. And he was trained under a little-known pupil of Titian. So the teachings are among the very best that an artist could receive. Michelangelo was very popular among the young artists of the time, but the mature artists, the seasoned artists, didn't really care for him. Vincente Carduccio wrote in the book A Dialogue on Painting that Caravaggio was, quote, an omen of the ruin and demise of painting. Another critic called him, quote, the Antichrist of painting, and he had temper issues. Caravaggio is really the first bad boy of art. What we know about him mostly comes from police reports, and it almost starts off like a joke. It's literally, they start with Caravaggio walks into a bar, and unfortunately, trouble ensues. He ended up killing someone in a bar fight in 1606, and he has to leave Rome as a fugitive. The remaining 4 years of his life is spent on the run, traveling around the southern portion of Italy. And what's exciting about this is many paintings end up being found in these out-of-the-way churches and homes. Basically, what Caravaggio would do for food and lodging is in turn barter a painting he would create. So it's exciting. Every few years it seems like a Caravaggio painting is found in one of these far off places. He does die very young, most likely from fever, at the age of 39. Now, when he first arrived in Rome, though, he was a painter of still lifes. And still lifes are inanimate objects. If you were to take a painting class, this is the very first thing that you would paint, is a still life. It's the very bottom of the rung in terms of the hierarchy of painting. But Caravaggio's works were very, very real. You can see how this image here is not of an ideal basket of fruit. The fruit has spots on it. The leaves, in fact, have fungus diseases. Some are wilting and turning brown. But it is very much an everyday image showing reality rather than idealism. Now, even though Caravaggio will move on to paint figures, he's still very much concentrated on these minor elements in his paintings. In fact, he himself proclaimed that he put as much effort into painting a basket of fruit as he does the human figure. And we call him the father of still life paintings. One thing that's particularly unique about this work is that it is at eye level. And it looks like the basket is very much at the forefront of this painting rather than back on its own table or some type of support. It literally juts out into our space. Caravaggio was very unconventional when it came to painting. Basically, it looked like his figures were playing dress-up, and the models that he used tended to be laborers or workers. When you look at this gentleman here who's dressed up as Bacchus, you can tell he is a farmhand. He has a tanned face and tanned hands. If I could show you a detail of the hand that's holding the wine glass, you'd notice there's even dirt under his fingernails. And this work is also very much cutting edge in terms of the idea of Bacchus being this androgynous figure. Somewhat feminine, even in a way, unlike Donatello's statue of David. We have painted lips, arching seductive eyebrows, offering us wine while playing with this bow that is keeping his robe fastened. Again, we look at the still life that's in front of the figure that is rotting, and It could be telling us to enjoy life's pleasures while you can, or could also be telling us to avoid the sins of the flesh. Later on, Caravaggio paints himself as Bacchus in this self-portrait. And one of his most famous works, The Calling of St. Matthew, really shows what a Baroque painting is. We have that light coming in from the right-hand side very readily in many of the paintings of this time period. And kind of a darkened background. We have very richly colored figures where we really can't tell where the lines of their clothes end and the next figure begins. We have a wonderful transition. Again, it's one of the advantages of using oil paint as a medium. But when we see Christ in the right-hand side, and he's barely identifiable by that very light halo above his head, that he's pointing towards someone who is St. Matthew. And we're not really sure who or which figure St. Matthew is. We have the bearded man kind of in the center facing us, where he's like either pointing toward him or pointing toward one of the two individuals to his right. St. Matthew was a tax collector. The young man in the very far left image closest to us is counting money. So it is unclear which figure here is St. Matthew. And this work is Caravaggio's first public work, located in the Contrelli Chapel of the Church of San Luigi dei Franceschi in Rome. And it's a very large painting, about 10.5 feet by 11.5 feet. And here's another altarpiece that he does. The Conversion of St. Paul, again, a very mysterious work. This is an altarpiece, and it's very odd, too, that the horse's rear end would be over the altar. So, again, he's really kind of pushing the idea of what would be acceptable in a church. But we have no or little indication of religion in this painting. We don't see a heavenly power that is converting him. We don't really see Paul's response except for him holding his arms toward the heavens. The painting is mostly about this horse, and it looks like it's going to step on him. This is the second version of the painting. The first version was rejected by the church. And this is also a good painting to talk about tenebrism. Tenebrism is defined as dramatic illumination. It is as if a spotlight is falling on a dark stage, and we definitely have that here, showing on the horse and the figure of St. Paul. This painting is one that ended up getting him into a bit of trouble. The church declined this painting outright. With the death of the Virgin, the model that he used for the Virgin was a body of a dead prostitute that had been fished out of the river. And so you can see why that the church definitely rejected this. And many of the rejected paintings by Caravaggio were bought or purchased by individual collectors. The Supper at Emmaus, a very famous painting by Caravaggio. We can see how he has changed Christ into a somewhat feminine type of figure with long curly hair. He is clean shaven in this instance. And at the Supper at Emmaus, this takes place in the book of Luke, where two apostles are walking to the city of Emmaus. They meet the resurrected Christ, and it's only at dinner, this scene here, that they realize that they have been walking with Christ when he says the blessing. Again, we have a still life, this time teetering precariously at the edge of the table, and we have a wonderful dark halo around the figure of Christ and his shadow, showing betrayal. A common scene in art history, the image of Judith beheading Holofernes. Another severed head image. This time Caravaggio has painted himself as the severed head of Goliath. And besides Caravaggio being noted as the father of still life painting, he's also the first painter who really does a genre scene, a scene from everyday life. And in this case, it's a wonderful painting called Card Sharps, where we have two individuals that are cheating this third one while playing cards. And lastly, the head of Medusa, again a self-portrait of Caravaggio as Medusa. Caravaggio's following of young artists are called the Caravaggisti, and I'm going to go over some of the more popular ones. That would be Georges de la Tour, again a painting that really shows the essence of Tenebrism. We also have Georges de la Tour in a very similar image to Caravaggio's Card Sharps, called The Cheat. Orazio Gentileschi, who is not as famous anymore as his daughter Artemisia. In fact, we have a lot of issues separating out the paintings between the two artists. During Artemisia's upbringing, it was an issue of women were not really allowed to be painterly, and Artemisia painted many works that her father sold under his name. But in Artemisia's self-portrait here, this is a very unique self-portrait. In order for her to grasp her painting this side of her, she had to set up a series of mirrors that were able to capture this view. And so it really shows what an incredible technical painter she was. One of her first paintings that she created at the age of 17 is Susanna and the Elders. Like Caravaggio before her, she creates another scene, this time Judith beheading Holofernes. And Judith is living in the city of Methuselah, which is going to be attacked by the Assyrian army, and Holofernes is the general of that army. So her and her chambermaid sneak over to the enemy camp. They get Holofernes drunk and they decapitate him, hanging his severed head in front of the city gates so her city does not get attacked in the morning. And of course, this is a very popular and a very kitsch scene. And we also have, in this case, the lute players, one by Orazio at the left and Artemisia at the right. And this is, again, a Judith and Holofernes image where they're carrying out the severed head. Artemisia at the right, Orazio at the left. And we're going to jump over to Spain for just a little bit to talk about Diego Velázquez, who is the court painter for Philip IV of Spain. And like Caravaggio, Diego Velázquez paints what he sees. He paints reality. In this case, the water cellar of Seville is a portrait of the water cellar of Seville. And you can look at this gentleman's haggard face. You can look at how well he recreates the ceramic pots as at the basis of this painting. Los Borrachos is a painting that was done for the summer home of the king. Now, borrachos translates into the drunkards, and in Spain, this would very much have been an insulting term. You could be a drunkard in all the other countries, but in Spain, that was definitely something to take offense to. And it's a very unconventional focus on a classical perspective where you have Bacchus being surrounded by these other individuals. And it really looks more like a contemporary image for a liquor store, for cheap advertising, for a cheap liquor, I should say. Really, the ultimate image that Velázquez creates is called Las Meninas. And with this image, it really shows the family of King Philip IV. It is a gigantic painting, about 10.5 feet tall, 9 feet wide, currently held in the Prado Museum in Madrid. And it's done about 4 years before Velázquez passes away. And you might notice that it looks very similar to the Arnolfini portrait that we saw by Van Eyck a couple of weeks ago. And what's exciting is the Arnolfini portrait was literally in the court. It was owned by Philip IV. And so Velázquez would actually have been able to see this painting. And this is one of the reasons we think that the image of the king and queen in the back of this painting is a mirror rather than a painting of the king and queen. But looking at the image here, the exciting thing about it is that it really shows that this is an open painting. And earlier on in the lecture, I told you the difference between a closed painting where everything happens within the frame. Now we have an open painting where the focal point could be outside the frame, as we see kind of people that have stopped and everyone's looking out at us. We have the king's daughter, Marguerite, down in the center, and she's about 5 years old at this time. The painting itself, Las Meninas, translates to the maids in waiting who are on either side of the princess. Diego Velázquez himself at the left, painting on a very large canvas. Out the doorway is Jose Nieto, who is the chamberlain for the queen. The dog in the very foreground is Philip IV's true dog. In fact, there are more pictures of the king and the dog than the king and the queen. It's the most painted dog in art history. Off to the right, we have a dwarf, and we also have then the court jester off to the far right. In the upper right-hand side, kind of in the shadows, is a bodyguard. Velázquez ends up inspiring many future artists, including Goya, Salvador Dali, and even Pablo Picasso. We have some takeoffs of this painting by Peter Joel Witkin. This is a performance of Las Meninas with real people dressed up as the figures. And this slide is mismarked. It is the Prado Museum, not the Louvre, that this painting is in. And we have some street art. One last figure I want to talk about for the Baroque is Borromini. And Borromini was an architect, and he created the Church of San Carlo of the Four Fountains. What's exciting about this church is you can see how the foreground is, or the front of the church, is very much undulating, kind of curving in and out. And I think I have a figure, here we have the image here, that really shows how it's created. And it's just an incredibly different way of creating a building during this time. Very, very innovative. And a semicircular instead of round dome. And of course, there is at this intersection a fountain at every corner, hence the name, the Church of the Four Fountains. And with that, that's going to end our lecture on the Baroque period of Italy and Spain.